Thank you all for attending us, and thank you in advance to our presenters, Jasmin and Christopher Warwick from OECD and Carleton University, respectively. And thank you to the Canadian Journal of Economics and Jiki Chen for partnering with us on this webinar series. Before we get started, I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement. McMaster University is the host institution for the Canadian Research Data Center Network. The university is located on the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We'll begin this session by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. You can visit Native Land Digital, a space where people can learn more about the lands they inhabit, the history of those lands, and how to actively be part of a better future going forward together. Just a little quick housekeeping. We're in webinar format today, so if you have a question for the presenters at any time, you can pop it into the Q&A tool in your webinar bar, and each presenter will do a quick Q&A after their talk. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Jiki Chen, editor at CJE, to say a few quick words of introduction.
Thank you, Grant. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I would just, before I turn over to our speakers, I just want to remind everyone one thing. This is that Wiley, the CJE's publisher, has an agreement with the CRKN, the Canadian Research Network, with regard to publication in open access. So if you are a researcher affiliated with a Canadian university, the chances are you are actually covered under that agreement. What that means is that if you have a paper published in this, accepted for publication in CJE, you can actually choose to publish it under open access for free. There will be no cost to you as the author. So I just want to remind everyone of that opportunity. So next time, if you have a paper accepted, keep that in mind. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to turn the floor to Jasmin Thomas, who will tell us about her research on daycare and women's labor market participation. Go ahead, Jasmin.
Awesome, thank you. So I am going to share some slides, and it would be fabulous if someone could give me a shout once it's full screen and visible. A thumbs up.
It is invisible.
Perfect, amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, so first off, thank you for inviting me to present today. I'm really delighted to be here. Super excited to see my work published in CJE last year, and I'm really excited to share it. I really only ever shared this in working paper format, so it was pretty cool to go back through all the slides and update it now that it's all through the revise and resubmit process of CJE. So before I dive in, I will start with the disclaimer. These are my views. Everything I say today is mine and mine alone, and no responsibility should be attributed to Statistics Canada, the Government of Nova Scotia, the Department of Finance Canada, or the OECD, who are all, provided the data or employed me at some point. But despite that, they are just mine. So now, with that important disclaimer aside, if the title slide or the abstract or the paper that you may have read before this did not give it away, I'm going to show you some results today that use geographic and temporal variation in the rollout of free full-day programming for 4-year-old children in Nova Scotia over the 2017 to 2018 to 2020 to 2021 period to look at the impact on women's labor market outcomes. Since I imagine you are not super familiar with Nova Scotia and or not all of you are from Nova Scotia, I'm going to give you 2 key pieces of information that'll set up the rest of the paper. First, Nova Scotia is composed of 7 mutually exclusive Anglophone school boards. These are called Regional Centers for Education. And second, starting in 2017 to 18, Nova Scotia began offering a voluntary program for 4-year-old children through something called pre-primary, which you'll hear me say a lot over and over today, pre-primary, and full implementation was achieved in 2020 to 2021. From an implementation perspective, RCEs, or those Regional Centers for Education, used local selection processes that took community need, childcare availability, geographic distribution, and infrastructure availability into account to result in the implementation rollout you see in front of you. So, for example, in year 1, there were 46 schools that were selected. In year 2, there were 99 for a total of 145 that received treatment, and so on and so forth. In our last year, there were 8,300 children that were eligible for pre-primary, but it's a voluntary program, so not necessarily that the parents have to enroll their children. And there were 6,200 enrolled. This represents about 75%. As context, before the program was introduced in 2016-17, there were about 60% of children enrolled in, subsidized private market childcare. So this suggests the program at least has bite, with a 15 percentage point increase in enrollment of children in some form of early learning and childcare. Now, as you probably are all aware, attending this webinar, this is not a new area of research at all. There are many, many papers on the topic of women's labor supply and childcare. So we've got our papers from Quebec. We have a couple of papers from Ontario that look at expanding kindergarten from part-time to full-time. And there are a ton of papers from the US and many other countries looking at preschool, kindergarten, or some form of the equivalent. So if all of these studies exist, then why this paper? Do we need yet another study that's looking at this impact? Obviously, because this paper ended up being published and I'm here talking to you today, I think yes, but I'm going to take a little bit of time to try to convince you. So first, there is the possibility of confounding factors in the case of Quebec. At the same time that Quebec was rolling out its low-cost childcare, it was also enhancing parental insurance. It was implementing full free-day kindergarten for 5-year-old children. It was introducing low-cost before and after school care for school-aged children, and it was implementing significant changes to other family policies and child benefits. Second, although the two papers from Ontario are similar and look at the concept of expanding access to kindergarten, they were looking at the concept of additional hours of childcare, so going from part-time to full-time. Whereas I'm looking in this paper at the concept of an additional year of childcare. One additional year could have actually an important implication for labor market outcomes, especially from the context of gender equality, because theory suggests and research shows that women in the labor market that are out of the labor market for longer tend to face bigger implications for their wages and earnings going forward. So reducing time out of the labor market from 4 to 3 years could actually be really important for gender wage gaps, labor force participation rates, and so on and so forth. Third, although Canada and the United States are in many ways very similar, external validity could be a problem because they have different approaches to family policies like family leave and maternity leave. There are differences in the availability and affordability of alternative care arrangements, and there may be differences in preferences towards remaining at home or putting your child in care. Fourth, there's actually very little consensus in the literature. Context, data, and methodology seem to matter a lot for the size and direction of the impact, and also which groups are impacted. And then fifth and finally, and if I can't make you remember anything from today, if there's one thing that you remember, strong program evaluation is always a good idea, and it's always very important. So I hope I've convinced you that this is worthwhile and that you'll stick around for the rest of it. But with that, I'll jump right into the data. My dependent variables come from the Labor Force Survey, and which I access through the Federal Research Data Center, probably why I'm here today presenting to you. I use data from September 2014 to December 2019, and I drop the summer months and look at the population aged 25 to 54 years. My treatment variable, which is an indicator for receiving treatment at the school catchment area level, comes from the government of Nova Scotia. And to assign a treatment status to each observation in the labor force survey, I first map postal codes onto shapefiles by school catchment area. So this process results in this, produces this dotted map that you see here. Each dot represents the point on a polygon of a postal code, which when I was practicing this, I realized is a very excellent alliteration. But effectively, each dot here assigns a treatment status to the postal code, where lighter colors are earlier treatment years. And since the labor force survey has postal code information, we can then match individuals to a treatment status. So next, on to the methodology. I use a staggered difference in differences estimation procedure. based on Callaway and Santana. This methodology addresses the issue of forbidden comparisons, which sounds a lot sexier than it is, but it's effectively where you have a case of forbidden comparisons refer to the case where an already treated group is incorrectly used as a comparator for a group that's currently receiving treatment. So to overcome this issue, the methodology involves running a 2x2 comparison of treated and control groups and aggregating these coefficients, these betas, post-estimation using non-negative weights. The equation on the slide that you see in front of you is the 2x2 regression whose betas are then subsequently aggregated. So in simple English, on the slide in front of you, you see my treatment and control group. It is worth noting that the methodology proposed by Callaway and Santana allows for both not treated and not yet treated control groups. My preferred specification is the not yet treated approach. This means that I'm never actually estimating a treatment effect for the final treatment group, those observed in 2020 to 2021. I excluded this group because of the elephant in the room, COVID-19. It actually worked out quite nicely that they were the last group and COVID-19 happened so that I could use them as a control group. But as with all applied econometrics work, I undertake a battery of robustness exercises and use other control groups, such as women with children who are too young and/or children who are too old and women with no children. If you're not yet familiar with this literature, to get from this series of betas, these coefficients, from our 2x2 regressions into the traditional average treatment effect on the treated that everyone is familiar with, there's just a simple two-step process. In the first stage, the betas from within one group are aggregated across time. And then in the second stage, those aggregates are then further aggregated across groups. Now, before I show the results, I'm going to show this classic event time visualization of unconditional parallel trends, since my specification relies on, my identification relies on this assumption. Visual inspection of this graph suggests that we don't have any pre-treatment trends and that there's this clear upward shift in estimates post-treatment. But these are, of course, assumptions, and they're inherently improvable. This is just everyone's favorite graph, and no DID paper would be complete without it, so here it is. But my paper does talk about some of the limitations around this exercise in the staggered difference and differences setting, as well as in general. So now, the moment you've all been waiting for is the main results. In my preferred specification, I find an impact of 21 percentage points. And naturally, in this type of context, it's important to break it down for different subgroups. Looking at this table, you're probably thinking that some of these impacts are implausibly large, and I would agree. 68 percentage points is pretty large, but that reflects my use of linear probability models. Ideally, I would have used logit models, but at the time of writing this paper, a program for that did not exist, and I am not a programmer, so I used linear probability models. So with that as a context, what I want you to take away from this slide is not the exact point estimate, but instead the idea that not married women saw a much larger impact than the total population or the population of women on average, as well as women whose youngest child was aged 4 years old. And these are the results that we would expect if we assume that not married women, as a result of income constraints, had a harder time accessing childcare. And also for women whose youngest child is 4 years old, we would also expect this because there are no other constraints around finding childcare for younger children. So that's the takeaway, not the exact point estimates. I also ran some regressions for other labor market outcomes, as one does in these types of papers. And apart from employment, none of them are statistically significant. The signs are, however, operating in the direction that we might expect for 3 reasons. The first are probably familiar to you. We have income effects, and we have probably income effects and probably compositional effects around selection into and out of the labor force. The third one might be a little bit less familiar, and this is what I term coordination problems. So pre-primary, just like the school day, is shorter than a regular business day, which means that parents that use childcare must find some form of before and after school care. They have to choose flexible working arrangements. They have to alternate pickup and drop off with their spouse, or they have to reduce their hours, all of which would have a negative impact on the intensive margin. So in general, it's quite difficult to compare estimates across papers in this literature because each paper is looking at a unique country, policy instrument, time period, population, subgroup, etc. And all policies are adopted within specific institutional settings, and these all can affect external validity and obviously the estimated treatment effect. So with this caveat in mind, I present you a density graph of previous estimates in the literature to show you that my estimate is exceedingly large. And of course, it's possible that some of these estimates in this graph are downwardly biased because of the use of traditional DIDs, but not all of these papers actually used traditional DIDs. So this kind of begs the question, what's going on? Especially since my traditional estimate is also very, very high. So to make sure that these very high numbers made sense, I ran some alternative control groups. And these exercises are here on the screen. And as you can see, these coefficients are also extremely large. So this gives me fairly good confidence that the pre-primary program in Nova Scotia really did have large impacts on women's labor force participation for women who had 4-year-old children. But that still doesn't answer the why. What is going on and why does Nova Scotia have such a big response to this program? Of course, I can only hypothesize, but my educated guess is that this reflects, first, non-linearity. And what I mean by this is that the program introduced in Nova Scotia was substantial compared to other interventions. In particular, before the program was introduced, there were extremely elevated fees and it was difficult to find a childcare space. And this policy effectively reduced costs to zero and guaranteed availability, neither of which was the case in Quebec, the most common type of policy that's examined in the Canadian literature. So to me, this suggests that there might be something nonlinear going on with childcare availability and or affordability. So for example, going from $20 a day to $10 a day is not the same as going from $10 to $0. It may also reflect administrative burdens, which we are learning is a very big factor in limiting access to social protection systems, of which childcare is a factor. Indeed, finding childcare can be super hard for parents. They may be faced with long wait lists, which mean they have to apply for childcare years in advance, sometimes the moment they get pregnant. They may also be faced with high fees, which means navigating complex childcare subsidy systems and or spending hours finding suitable childcare that meets their budget. And then in comparison to this, so this is the state of the world in Nova Scotia before, possibly high fees, possibly long wait lists. And then you contrast this after the program, parents just have to walk to their local school and sign their child up for pre-primary and they're guaranteed a space. I'll let you guess which one's easier and which one has lower administrative burdens. Unfortunately, this last point, I did not actually put into the paper, and it reflects my recent learning in this space as I continue to learn more and research more into social protection systems. So consider yourselves lucky on my to receive what I've recently learned. And if I could go back, I would love to add this point. Now, before I close, I want to highlight kind of some key takeaways. I don't know who's in the audience today, but some of you might be econometricians and some of you might be policymakers. So if you have to walk away with something, I'm going to start with what I do not want you to walk away with, and that's the exact point estimates. And I definitely don't want them to be plugged into a model to estimate GDP impacts from investments in early learning and childcare. And here's why. Although these reports are super important and they have spurred government investments, and I think they are very valuable, I also think that context matters a lot, and we have to be very careful in which numbers are actually put into these models. So perhaps my number makes sense in a very specific context, but it would be important for whoever is designing that model to be very sure that this is the number they want to use in that context. So please do not willy-nilly plug my models into plug my numbers into any models, and do not walk away thinking that 20 percentage points is what everybody's going to see from investing in childcare. As I said at the beginning, context matters, and this context includes price, availability, and quality before and after the program is introduced. Instead, what I want you to walk away with is that childcare is important for mothers' labor supply. And this has been shown across many, many papers. So this is kind of a non-controversial point. I also want you to take away that there is the potential for non-linearity in the availability and affordability of childcare. Third, as I've said multiple times today, should just get a t-shirt made that says it, context matters. And since context matters, I also want you to walk away and possibly, if you can, just take away one thing, that program evaluation is always important, even if 1,000 papers have done it before. And I think this is especially true as we go into a world with scarcer resources for social protection systems and as governments draw back on spending. We need to know what works, where it works, why it works, and when it works. So with that whirlwind tour of my paper, I will stop. I hope I'm within the time limit that was allotted to me, and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, you're just fine. So I don't remember, folks, if you have a question for Jasmin, please put it into the Q&A box on your webinar tool. I will ask, just to kind of start the discussion a little bit, did you look into, I noticed the coefficient on sort of married women was a little more what one might expect from this kind of a project, but not significant. Did you look into whether there was sort of intersections with income or anything where it might have mattered for some groups and not others on the whole?
So we're looking at Nova Scotia, small province with 4-year-old women, or women with 4-year-old children. So again, like we're now shrinking it even more. So I did have some sample size constraints on what I could do. And the labor force survey doesn't have income. So I did look at hourly wages. And as I was presenting, I realized that I did not write that into the tabulation. But the coefficient on hourly wages is negative for kind of the same reasons we might expect with coordination problems, income effects, and selection into and out of the labor force.
Okay, so Anna Ferrer asks, do you have a sense of why immigrant women show a lower effect, however significant, even with the small sample size?
Yeah, I don't actually have a theory on that. And in my robustness exercises that whether immigrant women were smaller or larger than non-immigrant women, it actually changed quite a bit. So sometimes non-immigrant women were higher and sometimes non-immigrant women were lower. So I didn't really want to get into my paper because I'm not super confident on which one is higher or lower. And I think that really depends on methodology.
A comment from, oh, they're coming in fast and furious now. Okay, so a comment, perhaps the large response is to some extent intertemporal from mothers who would have gone to work the next year.
It's possible, yes. But I think the important thing here is kind of what I said, that this matters because time out of the labor force is a really big contributor to differences in gender equality in the labor market. So reducing time out of the labor market from 4 to 3 years, it might seem like even if it is just temporal, like, oh, well, who cares? I think we still should care because it can have significant downstream effects on gender equality.
There was a follow-up question from Anna, just roughly, immigrant composition in Nova Scotia in your data set. What's the sort of...
I would have to look that up, and I do not have the sample with me right now. It is in another drawer in my apartment. I'm sorry.
Okay. And I think we've already touched a little bit on this one, but coefficients for immigrant married women or any other interactions that you might be able to comment on?
No, I was really limited by sample size, as anyone who's worked at the FRDC would respect and understand. Had to be really careful about what I took out and what I did because it can trap you in the future on other things that you can do. So I tried to reduce like multiple intersections as much as possible just to protect myself from being trapped in a corner. As like this is important, not saying that it's not important, it's very important to protect privacy, but I just, from this point of view of a research paper, it's important not to reduce sample size too much.
Yep. And a question from Arju Bani Hashem. Do you have information on employment rates of these women pre-policy? And do you think that these employment rates could affect the effectiveness of these programs? And then, policy in an environment with 70% employment is different from one where the rate is 25% per se.
Yes, so I do. And again, I think this is where it's around 60 to 70%, depending on how you define the sample. And I think this is why the coefficients are a bit implausible, is that now we're above a 1%. Again, this is the lack of logit models in a staggered setting at the time that I was writing. But it does suggest that there are very strong effects going on. I just don't think that, yeah, the 68 percentage point for that certain group is a bit outrageous, and even 20 percentage points is pretty generous.
Do we have any last questions for Jasmin before we turn our attention to Chris's paper? Going once, going twice. Thank you so much, Jasmin, for presenting a very interesting paper.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Okay. We now have Christopher Worswick from University of Carleton, or Carleton University, I guess, who's going to present a paper on the topic of immigration and labor. Thank you. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Grant. Actually, I've got to share my screen, I guess. Should have done that. So you should be able to see that now.
We do, but we're not in presenter mode. So there we go. Now we are.
Now we are? Okay. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to present. We were very happy to see this paper come out in the Canadian Journal of Economics. We're really pleased there was interest. So let me just give a 30-second description of where this paper started. It basically started during the COVID lockdowns, and I was following. As you can see, my co-authors are Matt Doyle and Mikhail Skuterud from University of Waterloo. And I reached out to Mikhail, or he reached out to me, I can't remember. And we were kind of lamenting the fact that so many politicians and media figures would sort of assert these large economic benefits from immigration without really defining them. And at that time, this was sort of before the surge in temporary migration that we've seen in recent years, but permanent immigration had been ratcheted up. And I'll show you some hard numbers on that in a second. So it was kind of in this context that we thought we should write a paper saying, what do academic economists think about this? And so that was the motivation. The idea of targeting immigration levels or putting it in the title sort of evolved from that, it was more initially about what are the economic benefits of immigration, and does that shed light on what optimal policy is? And so in that regard, it's quite a different paper than a lot of empirical labor papers that I've written in the past. And I think the associate editor, without naming names, commented in the first referee report was that he admired the ambition of this paper. And I think it is an ambitious paper, and it's intended to be thought-provoking. So I look forward to any comments people have. So let me just quickly go through the main contributions. So as I've already said, we consider immigration benefits within the context of a growth framework. I'm not sure I did actually say that, but we're thinking, well, let's, there's this literature on economics of immigration. There's literature on what drives economic growth. Can we look at sort of the intersection of them, or look at the two literatures and say, can we sort of shed light on this question? Are there these large economic benefits to immigration? Do they cause economies to grow faster? And then in that context, does this shed light on what policy goal we should be pursuing? And how to devise optimal immigration policy in some sense. And so we then spend some time, I'll show you some numbers on this, on sort of arguing that high levels of immigration have not led to higher GDP per capita in Canada. And we zero in pretty quickly on GDP per capita. I mean, normally, if you think about growth economics, we divide by the population. We turn everything into per capita numbers pretty quickly, because you don't want to have a situation in which a population grows really rapidly, the economy grows, but average living standards just drop more and more. And there's some concern that may have been happening in the last 5 to 10 years. And then from that analysis, we propose a condition for the optimal level of economic immigration. So or you can think of it as a condition or a rule of thumb that policymakers could use to say, well, is this economic policy of immigration, does it meet some reasonable standard? And I should say that we're really focused on economic immigration. We're really not talking about family immigration or refugees. And then to sort of evaluate whether our optimal condition is something that's easily met or something that would lead to a very different selection of immigrants into Canada, we focused on the 2005 landing cohort of economic immigrants to Canada. We chose 2005 initially because we wanted to sort of we wanted to give the immigrants a chance to get established in Canada. And so we chose a 10-year window, and a lot of our analysis is focused on 10 years later where we had data. Does it look like the immigrants who were chosen in 2005 as economic class principal applicants, does it look like they would have been chosen using this optimal condition that we developed? So let me just talk a little bit about the immigration rate in perspective for Canada. So over the 2000 to 2017 period, the immigration rate, or the number of immigrants, all immigrants landing in Canada in a given calendar year divided by the population of Canada that calendar year, it ranges from 0.7% to 0.83%. And going back to like the Chrétien years in the 1990s, there was this sort of aspiration, like, wouldn't it be great if we could get to 1%? But up until 2017, I don't believe that had happened in my lifetime, to put it in perspective. Now, under the federal Liberal government, the current government, the numbers started going up. So it went up to 0.87% in 2018, then 0.91% in 2019. It dropped during COVID to 0.49% when there was just not a lot of international migration. But then it's really surged after that. It went to 1.12%. So now it's over this 1% aspirational level. And I note here, this is the highest since 1957. And the rate had been on track prior to the recent changes to reach 1.21% in 2024 and even 1.24% this year. So pretty massive increase compared to 0.7% at the lower bound of the 2000 to 2017 period. Now, since the paper was written, there have been recent cuts announced. The federal government, has rethought this strategy for different reasons. And now the targets are more like 395,000 for this year, 380,000 next year, even 365,000 for the following year. And I just did some quick estimates of what these would mean for rates. It's likely 0.95% for this year, and going down to, for 2027, probably about 0.87%. So in a sense, the most recent changes take us back to something close to where we were circa 2018, let's say. And I think it's fair to say that there is some doubt about follow through on this policy. The governments in Canada often talk about reducing these targets, but often the numbers come in higher. And I think there's to be fair, there's a legitimate question about refugee claims. A lot of temporary residents, there's concern that they're in higher numbers than in the past claiming refugee status near the end of their academic program. So I'm not saying they're going to meet these targets, but that's what they've listed as their targets. Okay, so let's think a little bit about the way economists think about economic immigration and the benefits of economic immigration. And George Borjas, who's obviously a leading figure in this field, has talked about an immigration surplus. And the idea here is that immigration raises the welfare of the pre-existing population. And then you can make an argument that new immigrants could be considered better off by, say, a revealed preference argument. So I'm not sure I completely buy this, but you could say, well, if immigrants can return to their home country fairly easily, then, and if they choose to stay, then by revealed preference, they may be better off. And so a lot of people have appealed to this type of argument to say, well, immigration raises economic welfare of the whole population, because if the immigrants are in any way kind of complementary to the pre-existing population, then you'd see the pre-existing population doing better, and the new immigrants are happy to be in the country, and so it seems like a good policy. And like a recent paper, I believe was in the CJE in 2022 by Basso, Perry, and Rahman, they're quite explicit on this. They sort of say less skilled immigration has downward pressure on wages in the low-wage service sector, and this incentivizes native-born workers to move into relatively skilled jobs, boosting productivity and earnings in the native-born workforce. So there's this sense in which, you know, in a sense, the welfare comparison is really focused on the pre-existing population. And there are papers in the literature, like John Kennan at Wisconsin has done a couple of really interesting papers sort of arguing that if you removed all immigration barriers in the world GDP per capita would go up. And I think that's right. That sounds right, but it's not clear that all the countries' GDP per capita would necessarily go up. High wage countries might see their GDP per capita go down. So that's the kind of question we're dealing with here. We're sort of saying, well, Canadian politicians and policymakers have been argued that these large economic benefits from immigration. And so we're trying to say that within the context of a country like Canada, are we sure about that? Or does the context matter? Does the way you select immigrants matter? So does this make sense in a Canadian context, this sort of Borjas surplus argument, or is there more to it? So what is the effect of potentially large inflows of unskilled workers? I mean, arguably, we've gone through this in the last few years with the large number of temporary foreign workers, and especially college level, private college, international students coming to Canada and working in low-wage jobs. Well, if the new immigrants are lower skill than average in the population, the risk, we think, is that this brings down average skill in the full population. And by the full population, what we're talking about are the pre-existing population plus the new immigrants. And we think that's part of the problem with the immigration surplus argument, is it just assumes that the new immigrants are better off by revealed preference. But if there were a large number of them, this would actually pull the average skill level down in the population. We also think it would worsen income inequality because it increases competition at the low-wage part of the wage distribution, in contrast to like a high-skilled immigration policy, which we're advocating for in this paper, which would increase competition at the high-wage part of the distribution. So our sense is this might make sense for like a guest worker program. So you imagine a country that brings in guest workers and doesn't let them stay. Then maybe, I'm not endorsing this, but maybe one could make the argument that you just focus on the pre-existing population. But we argue in countries like Canada, new immigrants can become citizens. So they're part of the pre-existing population in the next year, arguably. Okay, something weird happening here. So, okay, that sentence I'm adding to the top is, we're making it's a static argument. So I think what you have to do is extend this to a dynamic framework. And then we argue that you should really be worrying about the welfare of the new immigrants themselves. So I better speed up. So what do we assert for a goal of economic immigration policy? So we argue that economic immigration programs should be designed to maximize GDP per capita or some measure of national income per capita of the full population. So the full population is the pre-existing population, adding in the new immigrants themselves. So it's not okay to bring in a whole bunch of less skilled people to work in low-wage jobs, even if that makes the pre-existing population better off, because the new immigrants matter. They're part of the full population, and that could, in many cases, that would pull the GDP per capita down. We don't spend a lot of time in the paper, but we do note that you should also be worried about how income inequality is affected. Okay, so let me jump ahead and we'll talk a little bit about technology and how immigration impacts growth. So again, this is all sort of mainly within a neoclassical growth framework. And I don't think I flagged this, but Matt Doyle, the other co-author, is a sort of macro growth researcher. And so once we started thinking about these issues, Mikhail and I asked Matt to join the paper very early on. And so that's his important contribution. Okay, so assuming constant returns to scale production, right? Immigration, so what that means is if we double all of the inputs, we double all the outputs at a national level. So immigration that expands the labor force without changing the average human capital level of the population is unlikely to affect GDP per capita. So the idea is if you have higher immigration and it doesn't really change the skill distribution of your labor force, even if capital grows to keep up with labor, you're doubling, inputs in the constant returns to scale sense. You're going to double GDP, but you're also sort of doubling the population. And so in GDP per capita, you're doubling the numerator and the denominator. There's no real reason to think GDP per capita in that context would grow. Now, it could even be, so this means that it's not clear that immigration is going to raise GDP per capita. So some of the economic benefits that policymakers assert to immigration in Canada, it's hard to see that in a neoclassical growth framework. And in fact, you could actually lower GDP per capita if there's capital dilution, when we show some evidence of this. So if capital doesn't grow as fast as the labor force, then you could actually see diminishing returns to the new labor input through the immigrants because your capital labor ratio is falling. Okay, so one might argue, well, what if immigration increases productivity? And that's an important point, a valid point. And that's, arguably that's getting into new theories of growth or endogenous growth theories. But let's just talk about it at a high level. Immigration could affect productivity growth through enhanced innovation or learning by doing. So we argue that the kinds of immigration policies that would capture this are likely to be most effective. If it's through innovation, then you want to select scientists, inventors, and entrepreneurs. If it's learning by doing, you'd want to select immigrants employed in sectors where the innovation is likely to occur. That can be difficult to do. We basically say our feeling is if you're going to do this, you probably want to focus on higher skilled immigrants. If there's going to be these types of effects on productivity and growth, higher skill, higher human capital immigrants seem like better candidates. We also argue, though, that both causes of productivity growth suggest that larger populations, like whole populations of a country, have larger growth in per capita income. And we review the international evidence and we show that there's not a lot of evidence that this is the case. And that shouldn't be too surprising because there's an important caveat to innovation effects for immigrants. As Jones notes, to quote him, we do not believe that Luxembourg or Singapore grows only because of ideas invented by the researchers in those small countries. Instead, essentially all countries eventually benefit from ideas created throughout the world. So from all of this, reviewing this literature, we kind of come to the conclusion that economic immigration to Canada is unlikely to affect the rate of Canadian productivity growth. But if it is going to affect it, it probably should be coming through higher skilled immigrants. And this is a figure that I won't dwell on it. It's basically relating the blue line's GDP per capita for Canada from 1960 to very recently. And we plot the immigration rate, the number of immigrants landing that year divided by the population. And we're basically showing there's not a very strong relationship. I mean, we saw a pretty sharp rise in the immigration rate in recent years. And there's certainly no short-term change in GDP per capita. We do some sort of simple econometric analysis. You can see it in table 1 if you want to see it, where we basically sort of say, is there any evidence that the growth rate in GDP per capita is affected by the immigration rate using different specifications? And again, I'm not saying you should take these estimates super seriously, but the point estimates come out negative. There's certainly not compelling, obvious evidence that increasing immigration raises the GDP growth rate. This is another figure from the paper, which is kind of interesting. Real capital investment per capita. And you can see over the period since, say 2017, 2014 even, what we're seeing benchmarking off the US, real capital investment per capita in Canada hasn't kept up with what's happened in the US. And this is not causal, but this is indicative of what we think part of the problem was, is we saw this surge in population, and for whatever reason, there wasn't a commensurate surge of capital. So this is consistent with capital dilution. So our interpretation is, to be explicit, the capital stock per worker grew up to 2016, but has since been flat. Capital non-residential investments are not keeping pace with population growth. The influence of the population growth on Canada's housing crisis is widely recognized, but its influence on the non-residential capital stock is receiving little attention. And I think this all falls into this notion that's been around a long time, but isn't talked about a lot in the economics literature, of what is the absorptive capacity of a country to take immigrants. For many countries, this may not be a big issue, but in Canada, we have very ambitious immigration levels, especially in the last 7 years. And so then this gets at the capital dilution effect. And you can think of it like we're looking at non-residential capital, but you could also think of it as public capital. Like, are the hospitals and schools keeping up with the growth in the population? I think this is a valid question, and it needs more empirical research. We also talked about the potential impact that immigrants might have on total factor productivity, innovation. So here's just a slide. Again, nothing causal here. It's just benchmarking off the US, looking at TFP growth for Canada and the US, benchmarking off 1985. And you can see that over this period where we saw this big increase in our immigration rate, we're not seeing any short-term effects on TFP growth. So what do we conclude on productivity growth? Well, the shortfall in Canadian productivity growth was especially large over the period from 2001 to 2011. Canada's annual immigration rate was on average more than twice as high as the US immigration rate over that period. The Canadian immigration rate exceeded the US rate in every year between 1985 and 2021, and was more than twice as high as the US rate in 31 of this 37 years. But we're not, going back to the graph, we're just not seeing big impacts on on total factor productivity. Maybe there are confounding effects that, are important, but certainly, these benefits to immigration on productivity just don't jump off the page, that's for sure. Okay, I think I've gone through all that. Okay, so where do we come down on optimal immigration level? And again, I'm talking about economic immigration. So assuming a constant returns to scale production, technology, aggregate production, and the economy, immigration raises GDP per capita if the immigrants have higher average human capital than the pre-existing population. So does each immigrant admitted under this economic category, if they're have higher human capital than the average, then they'll tend to pull the average up. In this case, entries of newcomers will then raise the existing average skill level. And we argue that it's also more likely to produce beneficial externalities on productivity, either through creation of ideas, discoveries and innovation, or learning by doing. So we argue that you want to look for high-skilled immigration. That's certainly been the focus historically in Canada, although we've become distracted a bit lately with filling labor shortages at the lower skilled part of the distribution. But our argument is we shouldn't do that. We should focus on higher wage, higher skilled immigrants. So how would you do this in practice? So, and this, I think this is something that I know of no paper that's ever tried to capture this. So we all have targets for economic immigrants, and we have, lots of countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, have point systems. But what should be the cutoff? So here's what we're basically suggesting in a nutshell. The country should rank all economic immigrant applicants by their human capital, measured in some reasonable way. And then you should accept based on human capital in descending order from the highest. The highest human capital people are the ones who are going to have the highest earnings and pay lots of tax and probably not need a lot of government benefit support. And then we should accept an immigrant if the human capital is equal to or greater than the average human capital in the full population, taking into account the immigrants you're admitting that year. It's kind of a marginal argument. As long as this criterion is met, then you can argue that the immigrants will have at least some possibly modest impact on GDP per capita. But as soon as you pass this threshold, the marginal immigrant is arguably pulling down GDP per capita. Now, you're probably wondering about time period. We sort of suggest something like 10 years is reasonable. So we're not suggesting this should be a case in year 1 or year 2. In our simulations or policy experiment, we look at 10 years later. So what does this have what implications does this have for the level of immigration? So again, economic immigrants accepted in descending order of human capital. The final admitted immigrant that year would have human capital equal to the average of the full population. Give them some, in your decision on who to admit, give them some reasonable amount of time to update their credentials. So don't just judge them based on, performance in 1 year. Give them time to get acclimatized. And so for a given pool of applicants, this suggests a way to define the optimal level and set the target for future years. I'm kind of running out of time, but let me just describe quickly what we did. We went to IMDb census-linked data in the RDC. The work was done at Carleton. And we looked at the 2005 arrival cohort in the IMDb is immigrant landing records linked to subsequent income tax records. And we looked at the 2005 arrival cohort of individuals, and then we looked at their performance 10 years after landing. And so I'm going to actually just quickly jump, if I can. Hopefully you can still see this. So you should see the paper, table 3 from the paper. Maybe someone let me know if you can.
Yeah, we don't. We just see your slide view.
Oh, okay. Okay. Let me do it quickly. Should see it now, I think.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so basically this table captures kind of a thought experiment where, so we're looking at 2005 cohort of economic class principal applicants in 2015. So it's 10 years after landing for all of this. The first row has all people in this subpopulation, and the mean earnings is $55,300 in 2015. And then if you focus in on the 2005 cohort, you can see that these are economic principal applicants. They do well. They're above the average. So that's very encouraging. But then what we're basically saying is, well, could we have done better by applying this rule that says everybody should be raising the earnings? And so have earnings above the average. And so we're using earnings as a measure of human capital. And what we find is you go from 63,000 to 107,700 if you kind of crystal ball it and say, well, we'll just take the ones who 10 years later would have earnings above the national average. This leads to a pretty big drop in the cohort size. So we're excluding people by doing this. We go from 100% of the cohort down to 39% of the cohort, but a big increase in the mean to 71%, a 71% increase in the mean. Now might be thinking, well, you just can't see the future, and that's fair. So one of the things we do is we use the year 2000 prediction model or regression model to predict earnings in 2015. Now, this data from 2000 would have been available in 2005 when you're choosing the immigrants to be admitted, and you get an improvement. It's a modest improvement from 63,000 if you look at everyone in 2015 from the 2005 cohort to 66,000. But it's a 5% increase in the mean, but it's 16% drop in the number of immigrants admitted. And then we also do some analysis with the 2015 IMDb data and census, and using different models. So using a prediction model that's kind of mimics our current point system or CRS system, what we find is like a 7% increase in earnings and a 25% drop in the number of immigrants. And then if we extend it, like one argument is we probably don't use optimal information when selecting immigrants. So if we extend it to use field of study, which is something we really don't do now, so you separate science from arts, for example, then you start to see a larger increase, right? So you see 70,000 average earnings, 11% increase. And we argue that you could do much better than this. So I'm going to stop sharing, just go back quickly, and I'll wrap up. So actually, how about maybe I should just wrap up here now, because I want to leave time for a couple of questions. So you get the idea of the paper. It's meant to provoke thought on these questions, and we're really pleased to see it get into the CJE, and I look forward to any comments you have, and feel free to reach out to me afterwards if there aren't time to give comments. Thank you.
Okay, well, you did certainly provoke some discussion in the Q&A. I am going to try to sort of condense a little bit because we are 3 minutes till time. Can you comment a little bit on sort of the absorptive capacity and how that relates to the sort of sectoral composition of the immigrants? Because as you note, the policy levers seem to be targeting sort of industries where there's perceived shortages. But the sectoral distribution might have something to say about your paper, because the 10 years out is not, it's hard to predict now what's going to be popular 10 years out.
So just repeat the first sentence, Grant, please. So sectoral
just the sectoral distribution of immigrants, right? So I mean, if you're evaluating somebody on paper and you're trying to project what their outcome is going to be 10 years hence, the sector has to matter in some way. And just, can you comment on that?
I mean, sure. I guess we don't really do that now in defense. Like if you look at our immigration system, we tend to let immigrants go to whatever is the best jobs for them. So I don't think sector is a big part of selection. So in a sense, what we're saying is, let's take a similar approach. Let's let people go wherever they want. We're selecting mainly based on human capital attributes here. So I agree. I don't think you can predict sectoral composition in the future. So we're using kind of models. We're suggesting using models of human capital wage type equation models to predict future earnings. I would argue the CRS system and the original point system from the skilled worker program is basically a human capital earnings dressed up as an index function. And so we're doing something very similar to that, and then asking the question, well, where should you stop? But we're arguing, well, it doesn't really make sense to have a level of immigration where the marginal immigrant's pulling down average skill if it's an economic immigration program. Sorry, it's a long answer, but that's...
No, that's okay. But the next comment would disagree with you because, many trained doctors, engineers, et cetera, aren't transitioning because of, sort of credentialing requirements and difficulties there. So, I mean...
Sure. So we don't actually we do talk a bit about credential recognition in the paper. I think credential recognition is a really important area. And I think Canada, prior to the current surge in immigration, was making some serious progress on it. I think the way our analysis would point is to say, look, take the credential recognition problem as given and look at the performance of past people with these credentials and what kind of earnings they've got in Canada. And that might be as a pharmacist, right? It doesn't mean that they have to necessarily work as a doctor. It might be as a scientist. So I think credential recognition problems are real. Sometimes they're justified based on differential training across countries. But it doesn't mean that you don't admit the person. You just have a realistic expectation of what their future earnings are going to be, and you admit them based on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. We did have a few other questions, which I'm happy to send you after, but we
Sure.
are sort of at time. But I
Okay.
want to thank both our speakers for joining us today and for Jiki to helping us organize this. I think Jasmin is gone, but we'll round of applause her in her absence. She's actually in Paris, so she's well ahead of us in time. Oh, she's here.
I'm not
Hey,
gone. I stuck
not gone.
around.
Okay.
Hello.
All right, well, it must have been interesting then. There we go. Okay, thank you all so much. Just a reminder that our 25th anniversary conference is being held May 13th and 14th of this year, and you can find more information on our website. We would love to see everyone in the audience there. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks, Ziki.
Bye-bye.
Bye.